Ever wonder why rulers loved punishments that left the victim alive but ruined them in public? Neighbors pretended they hated it, yet they still showed up, then went home and warned their kids using the same details they claimed disgusted them. Today, I'm breaking down 20 most horrific torture devices ever created. Let's start with number 20. Flaying knife bench. Around 880 BCE, Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions openly bragged about flaying enemies alive and hanging skins on city walls. That means terror was carved into stone like a proud achievement. At Nimrud, reliefs tied to Ashurnasirpal II show prisoners pinned and cut for display, because the audience mattered as much as the victim. One inscription reads, "I flayed as many nobles as had rebelled," and the tone feels like a ledger entry, cold, tidy, finished. Skins on gates turned rebellion into a visual lesson, so even people who could not read still understood the rule. The flaying knife bench idea is basically that system turned into a setup, a rigid platform, limbs restrained, and small knives doing slow work instead of one quick strike. Slow changes everything. A crowd has time to settle in. People point, whisper, leave, come back, and the punishment keeps running like a public exhibit. And it was not isolated. Aztec accounts describe priests wearing victims' skin, and Christian tradition remembers Saint Bartholomew skinned for his faith. Different continents, same logic, fear that stays visible. People who witnessed it talked about smell as much as sight. If a state can weaponize skin, what does it do with bones? Here comes number 19, nail-studded whipping post. In 1731, a Royal Navy sailor was sentenced to 400 lashes, delivered in stages across several ships. That was discipline designed like a broadcast. Whipping posts sat in village greens, courthouse yards, and ship decks for centuries, and the location was the point. Roman soldiers whipped Jesus with a flagrum. Then European and colonial courts kept the same formula. Tie someone up where neighbors can watch, then let pain teach the whole street. 18th century records describe backs torn open after dozens of strokes for theft or desertion, because the law wanted memory, not mercy. A nail-studded whipping post turns one punishment into two. Picture nails, iron studs, or broken glass set where the whip lands, so every strike slams and then drags. Navy logs and plantation testimonies mention flogging till the bone showed, which tells you officials pushed far beyond correction and still wrote it up as order. And the post always looked ordinary at first. That normal look lowered defenses right until the first hit. If this is what happens on the ground, what happens when the floor disappears? Let's move to number 18, spiked suspension shackles. Trial records from Spanish and Italian inquisitors describe strappado sessions where prisoners were raised and dropped repeatedly. So the torture had a rhythm, and the body paid for every beat. Strappado worked simply, hands tied behind the back, rope over a beam, then the body yanked upward. Medical historians explain that minutes can dislocate shoulders and tear nerves, and those injuries can last long after a confession is forced out. In notes, officials wrote that prisoners were raised to the cord, like it belonged in routine paperwork. Spiked suspension shackles add teeth-lined cuffs into the same lift. Iron bites into wrists or ankles, and gravity keeps pressing even when the interrogator stands still. Hang higher, and the metal digs deeper. The person becomes their own crushing weight, and time becomes the lever. Surgeons later compared the damage to high-speed crash injuries because nerves and joints can be destroyed without a single cut. One alleged target was Niccolo Machiavelli, reportedly suspended after a 1513 conspiracy scare. He survived, yet letters hint at pain that stayed. So ask yourself, if joints can be wrecked with rope and weight, what happens when rulers aim for the body's center? Because the next step attacks the gut first. If you want a more dark history like this, hit subscribe and drop a like. Next one is number 17, intestinal winding crank. In 1352, Parliament wrote high treason punishment into law, and it included disembowelment. So the cruelty was printed into the rules of the state. In medieval England, hanged, drawn, and quartered followed a script. The condemned was dragged to the gallows, partly strangled, then disemboweled alive, beheaded, and cut into quarters. Chroniclers describe Edward I using this ritual against Dafydd ap Gruffudd in 1283, and later rulers kept repeating it for centuries. Accounts mention entrails burned in front of the condemned, which turns death into humiliation and the crowd into messengers. The intestinal winding crank compresses that record into one image, a hooked rod fixed to a winch, twisting a person's insides into rope. Later, torture chamber engravings often exaggerate details, yet the core idea matches the execution tradition. Start with the gut, keep it visible, and let the seam teach obedience. Then the body got turned into signage. Heads and quarters were placed on city gates, so families walked past them for weeks. The message lasted longer than the execution. When law can use organs as theater, a single pole can become a whole city's nightmare. And one ruler made that pole famous. Let's move to number 16, spiked impalement pole. 15th century sources tied Vlad the Impaler to impalement, but modern historians doubt the tens of thousands figure. Research suggests a few thousand, and that number still reshapes the word fear. Impalement appeared in several cultures, yet Vlad's name became shorthand for visible terror. German pamphlets and Slavic chronicles agree he used public display as policy, and policy works when it does not need explanation. A stake outside a city speaks to soldiers, merchants, and children in the same language. A spiked impalement pole adds barbs and hooks to rough timber, yet the principle stays unchanged. Bodies slide down under their own weight, sometimes left for days near major roads. One account claims an Ottoman envoy approached Targovishte, saw a forest of corpses, and turned back rather than advance. That is psychological warfare doing the job of an army. Supporters described it as justice, enemies called it brutality, but everyone remembered it. A road lined with bodies changes how people walk, talk, and even trade. When punishment becomes scenery, it follows you before you even reach the city. And then some states chose a mark that followed you forever. Here comes number 15, hot iron branding fork. French records mention galley convicts branded GAL, and English laws used letters like T and V for repeat offenders. So the body could carry the court record without paper. Branding worked because documents were scarce and scars were permanent. Courts burned marks into cheeks or shoulders so anyone could identify criminals on sight. Witnesses wrote about burning hair smells filling courtyards during mass sentences, and that detail hints at scale. The system could stamp people one after another. A hot iron branding fork makes the mark bigger and faster. Two heated prongs can stamp both sides of a face at once, or mark both shoulders in a single motion. One move and your future shifts, because that scar follows you to work, to relationships, and to every moment someone decides whether to trust you. Judges claimed branding protected society. In practice, the mark often blocked jobs, marriage, and safety, trapping people in the same underclass officials claimed they were controlling. Branding also creates a loop. Once you are marked, any accusation feels believable to outsiders. A scar that never fades is a sentence that never ends. And when scars were not enough, rulers started stretching bodies until they changed shape. Let's move to number 14, spine-stretching hook frame. A 17th century English pamphlet described a prisoner entering court so drawn in his limbs that he scarcely could crawl. That is the rack reaching beyond the room. Stretching frames like the rack pulled wrists and ankles in opposite directions until joints popped and ligaments tore. Descriptions mentioned spines damaged, nerves affected, and survivors walking away shorter or bent for life. Legal manuals even allowed moderate use to clarify testimony, which shows the mindset. Pain was treated like a truth machine. A spine-stretching hook frame pushes the same concept into a worse angle. Instead of ropes, hooks bite under ribs, collarbones, or hips. Then a crank drags the skeleton in unnatural arcs. With hooks, the pull focuses on the structure itself, and the spinal cord sits close enough that one hard turn can steal movement, sensation, and control. Doctors examining survivors of severe stretching reported chronic pain, numb fingers, and lifelong disability. That long-term damage mattered to officials. because a crippled survivor becomes a walking reminder, and reminders keep crowds quiet. So imagine being released and realizing the punishment still lives in your body. And when the crime was speech, the state went straight for the mouth. Next one is number 13, tongue-tearing pincers. In 1637, Scottish minister Alexander Leighton had his ears cut and nostrils slit for a pamphlet attacking bishops. That date proves speech could be punished like violence. Early modern states treated words as threats. Sedition laws allowed tongues to be pierced or cut, and lips split. And even when mutilation was uncommon, the fear shaped what printers and preachers dared to say. Inquisition files describe gags, bridal masks, and metal bits forced between jaws to silence dangerous voices, because rulers preferred quiet streets over arguments. Tongue-tearing pincers turned that threat into one tool, a hinged clamp with teeth tightened around the tongue, then yanked. 17th century engravings show similar pincers used on ears or nipples in public squares, which reveals a pattern, punishes the body part tied to the offense, and lets the crowd learn what speaking costs. A damaged tongue removes testimony, preaching, singing, even simple argument. One chronicler dryly wrote that a punished heretic spoke very little afterward, and that understatement lands because the life change is total. Once speech could be controlled, movement became the next target. And my feet were perfect, because everyone needs them every day. Let's move to number 12, burning coal footstocks. Survivors of soul torture were later described as struggling to stand for months, and some needed sticks permanently. That tracks because feet carry weight and hold dense nerves. Footstocks began as restraint and public shaming, ankles locked in wooden boards while passers-by mocked. In harsher settings, interrogators slid hot coals, heated irons, or embers under exposed soles. Chinese accounts describe grilling the soles. European prisons mention basting feet with oil over low fires. And Ottoman and Middle Eastern records describe bastinado, beating souls with rods. In some prisons, hot bricks or irons join the blows, stacking pain on pain. Burning coal footstocks combine those reports into a trap, hours stuck while heat creeps upward millimeter by millimeter. People often break early because foot pain triggers panic fast, and panic makes confessions messy and quick. Officials liked this method because it could cripple without obvious facial damage, letting a victim limp away while outsiders see fewer marks. A city can ignore one wounded person, yet it cannot ignore a person who cannot walk or work. That is why the feet were targeted. Heat under the body is awful, but weight on the body can feel even more final. And some courts turned crushing into procedure. Here comes number 11, bone-crushing press table. Under English law, peine forte et dure pressed prisoners with stones until they pleaded or died. So silence could trigger a legal crushing. Pressing punishments showed up across regions, yet England's version became infamous because it punished refusal itself. Court officials sometimes attended while weight increased slowly, and neighbors heard moans through prison walls at night. In France, the question extraordinaire used boards and wedges to squeeze limbs until bones cracked, and reports describe ribs snapping under rising load, because the pressure climbed in steps. The bone-crushing press table imagines a frame where screws drive iron plates down on arms, legs, or chests. No blade, no swing, just steady turning that forces the victim to feel time passing. A 17th century report describes interrogators tightening devices to the point of breaking, yet keeping life present, because they wanted answers, and a dead person gave none. Victims often lost circulation first, then sensation, then movement, and that staged collapse can feel endless. Officials could call it clean because blood stayed limited, yet the inside damage was massive. If a court can crush you for refusing to speak, a collar can control you for simply breathing. And collars were built to last. Let's move to number 10. Spiked collar choke chain. 18th century runaway slave notices described iron collars with prongs meant to snag on branches during escape. So the environment itself became part of restraint. Iron collars served as restraints and markers from Rome through the Atlantic trade. Museum examples show inner ridges, locking screws, and rings for chaining people to posts. Some collars carried owner names and numbers, which shows how normalized the system became. People were tagged like property. A spiked collar choke chain adds inward-facing teeth and a pull chain. Each tug tightens the throat, while points bite into skin, mixing choking with puncture. 19th century prison reformers documented inmates punished with tight collars that made swallowing agony and left permanent grooves around the neck. That detail matters because it shows how easy it was to injure someone severely without a dramatic wound. Officials framed collars as orders without executions. In practice, one guard could turn discipline into death in a hallway where nobody watched. Even when victims survived, neck injuries could linger, and fear could linger longer. When breathing becomes something another person controls, every second turns into negotiation. And once control worked, ordinary objects got turned into weapons. Here comes number 9, skin-raking iron comb. Roman accounts of Saint Blaise say officials tore his flesh with iron combs, and later writers repeated the phrase for centuries. So the image stayed alive because it feels too believable. Ancient and late Roman sources mention comb-like tools used on martyrs and rebels, and Byzantine writers reused lines about flesh stripped to the bones. Some repetition may come from copying, yet the shared description still signals a real fear. A tool that belongs in daily life can become torture without looking suspicious. The skin-raking iron comb builds on that. Picture a heavy rake with long, slightly curved teeth dragged across backs, arms, or scalps. Executioners liked tools that could be light in public and deeper in private, and the comb fits that perfectly. A shallow drag humiliates, a deeper pull tears skin open, and the wounds can look messy and hard to explain later. One church writer admitted some victims survived multiple sessions, covered in scars for life. Survivors become proof. People stare, whisper, and learn, even when the state stays quiet. A comb belongs near a mirror, so the mind struggles to accept it as a weapon. That mental twist adds extra fear. Scraping feels personal, yet some punishments were built for blunt force, and the face was an easy target. Let's move to number 8, jaw-smashing mallet block. Accounts of botched beheadings describe multiple strikes, teeth scattered in straw, and crowds watching every mistake. So execution day could turn into a public breakdown. Axes and swords required precision, yet reports from 17th century Germany still describe repeated swings and uneasy murmurs. Sometimes the condemned begged for another strike, because being half-finished is its own kind of torture. The crowd came for certainty and got chaos. And chaos makes people panic, because if the system cannot end it cleanly, what else can it do to you? The jaw-smashing mallet block turns that chaos into a design. A chin rest locks the head forward, and a heavy hammer strikes upward, shattering jawbones, teeth, and the base of the skull. Some accounts describe interrogators using heavy blows short of death to ruin prisoners before later appearances, because a wrecked jaw can silence a person without killing them. A French pamphlet noted that a certain noble could no longer answer questions after his jaw shattered on the scaffold. That line shows the goal can be control, because speech, eating, and dignity all break together. A jaw injury follows you into every meal and every conversation. And if the face can be shattered, the chest can be squeezed until breath feels scarce. Next one is number 7, rib-cracking chest vice. Doctors later documented survivors with healed rib fractures and chest deformities linked to sustained compression. So this method left medical evidence even when it avoided blood. Chest vices appear in medieval and early modern descriptions. iron frames wrapping the torso, then tightening slowly. That pressure bruised ribs, collapsed lungs, and strained the heart. Some designs added back spikes, forcing bone to give before metal did. Witch trial and political interrogation accounts mention suspects bound to boards while assistants tightened straps or plates, pausing every few turns to demand more names, because fear of suffocation makes people talk fast. The rib-cracking chest vise focuses on squeezing just below the armpits, forcing shoulders inward while ribs bow. Breathing becomes work, then panic, because the chest cannot expand properly. Survivors described weeks of pain afterward, where stares felt impossible and laughing hurt. That long tail is part of the point, because a survivor becomes a reminder in their own community. Quiet methods also hide easier. A door closes, the screw turns, and the outside world hears very little. Systems that care about reputation love that. When a device can break ribs without making a mess, secrecy becomes part of the weapon, and some devices hid the weapon in the furniture itself. Let's move to number 6. Organ-puncturing lance chair. Legal codes in parts of Transylvania, the Ottoman Balkans, and Safavid Persia mention stakes or spears as possible sentences. Even when surviving records show few cases, the threat shaped behavior anyway. Punishments tied to sexual and religious crimes often aimed at vulnerability, because shame and pain combined into social control. A sentence involving a stake becomes a story people repeat, and repeated stories police communities without constant enforcement. The organ-puncturing lance chair turns that threat into a trap. Imagine a seat with angled spikes hidden under the cushion and through the backrest. One lever, and steel points drive upward into the abdomen or lower chest. That design matters because it keeps the injury internal and harder to prove later, while keeping the victim alive long enough for questioning. Families described relatives who wasted away over weeks after interrogation, and that phrase suggests a gap between what happened and what could be shown. When damage stays hidden, accountability gets weaker and repeat use gets easier. The chair also flips trust, because a symbol of authority becomes the weapon, and that psychological twist can break people before the lever even moves. A trap that looks like a seat changes how a room feels forever. And when secrecy was not enough, chains brought fear back into the open. Here comes number 5. Barbed chain flogging rig. 19th century Royal Navy muster rolls recorded sentences of 200, 300, even 500 lashes. So punishment became arithmetic before it became injury. Navies, prisons, and labor camps used whips and chains when rods stopped intimidating. Observers wrote about backs cut to jelly, and that phrase appears across ports and years, suggesting a shared routine. Some captains spread lashings over days because flesh failed before the sentence ended. Others ordered punishment across the fleet, moving the victim from ship to ship so multiple crews watched and learned. The barbed chain flogging rig adds hooks to the links. Each swing bites, then rips free, leaving patterned wounds that resist healing. Guards could vary the force, light flicks for threat, heavy swings for collapse. The sound carried too. Chain on flesh travels through wooden decks and tight quarters, and everyone understands what that sound means. Punishment often continued after the lashes through forced labor, like silent deck scrubbing late into the night. That combination teaches obedience faster than any speech. A body can heal slowly, yet the fear becomes instant. A chain leaves marks, but hooks can turn a person into an object, and that shift changes everything. Next one is number 4. Scalp-ripping hook rack. Some 20th century accounts describe prisoners hung by hair or hooked caps as demonstrations, even if they were lowered quickly. That still caused scalp damage because skin tears with very little warning. Meat hooks already existed in abattoirs for moving carcasses, and torture accounts describe similar hooks driven through shoulders or back muscles for short suspensions. Later drawings may exaggerate, yet the mechanics remain brutal and simple. Steel points carry weight that muscle and skin cannot safely handle. The scalp-ripping hook rack pushes the idea to the head. Hooks tangle through hair or attach to iron caps clipped to the scalp. Then a winch lifts gradually until skin stretches and gives. Scalp injuries bleed heavily, and partial degloving can leave permanent disfigurement that changes how a person lives afterward. A modern forensic textbook notes that accidental scalp avulsions in industry often cause long-term psychological trauma along with physical scars, because identity and appearance take damage together. A head-focused device also changes the fear response. Once something clamps near your hairline, your body anticipates pulling even before it happens, and panic rises fast. If hair can become a handle, fingers become the next easy target, and hands were a future worth destroying. Let's move to number 3, finger-splitting wedge board. Museum collections include thumb screws small enough to fit in a pocket, proving officials carried them anywhere, so finger torture could happen without a special room. Old legal codes list thumb screws and finger crushers because small bones are easy to break and hard to repair. Tightening plates around digits destroyed fine motor skills, which meant victims lost writing, crafting, and work. During 17th century witch hunts in Germany and Scotland, interrogators used thumb screws on millers, midwives, and townsmen accused of consorting with spirits, tightening slowly while demanding detailed confessions. The finger-splitting wedge board adds sharpened dividers between fingers. Then, a screw forces the wedges apart while crushing at the same time. That combination spreads and breaks, making recovery harder. Surviving instruments showed deep grooves where fingers once sat, and some designs were built portable for field interrogations, which made the threat feel unpredictable. Officials sometimes claimed the victim stayed free after release. In practice, a craftsman without usable hands could starve quickly in a pre-modern city because skill was survival. This method also avoids spectacle, which can keep the wider public calm while one person's life collapses. A broken hand can erase a career, a family role, and identity. And then some regimes went back to spectacle with fire and a pot. Next one is number 2, boiling cauldron stand. In 1531 London, Richard Roos was reportedly boiled for poisoning under a statute tied to Henry VIII. That turned boiling into a state-approved spectacle. Historical records from Asia and Europe describe boiling alive as punishment for poisoning, counterfeiting, or rebellion. Ming Chinese texts mention rebels thrown into large heated cauldrons, and some accounts describe bones posted publicly after the liquid cooled, extending the message beyond the execution. Crowds gather the way people gather around fires, except the event was a human body, and that familiarity makes the scene more disturbing. The boiling cauldron stand turns the execution into a controlled setup, a platform locking prisoners over or inside a huge vessel while executioners manage the firewood beneath. Sometimes victims endured steam and scalding splashes rather than full submersion, and that choice can prolong suffering without a fast end. One chronicler admitted even hardened soldiers turned away, calling it beyond war, beyond justice, which shows the method pushed past what many people could stomach. A spectacle like this also punishes witnesses, because once you see it, your brain replays it. After heat, the last device removes sound and movement almost completely. And the last is number 1, live burial confinement box. Medieval German records describe women buried alive for killing husbands, and Japan's Anazime confined criminals in pits until death. So live burial appeared in real punishment systems, not just folklore. Some medieval and early modern European towns sentenced adulterers or religious dissidents to be buried in walls or pits, removing bodies from view while still sending a message through rumor. Records from parts of Asia describe traitors sealed in underground chambers to die unseen. Hidden punishments shift fear into imagination because people fill the silence with their own worst version, and that spreads fast. A live burial confinement box shrinks that fate into a container barely larger than the body. Air holes can delay suffocation, yet space stays too tight for movement. Some victims scratched messages into lids or walls, and archaeologists later uncovered that graffiti beneath monasteries and city squares. Excavated coffins sometimes show scratched lids and twisted bodies, a physical record of panic that court paperwork rarely captured. A punishment like this also removes the show, yet it keeps the message alive through whispers, because the community still knows someone was